from murky seas to clear waters. We're going to be using the Pond's method as a guide for instructor self-disclosure through social media. So the first thing we need to talk about is kind of the basis of this method. Of this model. Where did it come from? What is the literature that supports it? So we have to understand what is going on with social media at large. So social media is rapidly encroaching into many different aspects of our society right now. So public and private information. How does it affect cognition? How does it affect our attention span? And then are we more or less likely to self-disclose with the stuff that we put on social media? Or do we feel more inclined to self-disclose because of the other people doing it on social media as well? So when you look at that, it looks like a negative, right? It looks like this is kind of against proper sharing techniques, right? It seems like it's kind of forced. But social media is actually, in some regards, beneficial. A study by Kim back in 2017 found that social media applications like X, like TikTok, are being used as a supplemental educator instead of just kind of mindless entertainment. It's being used to bring in facts, educate their people on real-world events, news, conflicts, things of importance. Research also found that instructor credibility and self-disclosure ties in directly to student cognition and rapport from Degree 2015. And then finally, so the Pond's method is going to be a practical model. It's a practical look at helping instructors navigate the fluid climate of social media and how to best decide the course of action, whether they're going to self-disclose with relevant means or be completely irrelevant. So the first thing we talk about in terms of our literature is our pondering one. That will be the P in our ponds. So this dichotomy that exists between the ideas of rumination and pondering will provide the operational framework for Pons' first element, pondering. This operationalization will be cognitive complexity. So you look at these two things. You look at rumination and you look at pondering. Rumination is often an introspective look. It often has to deal with depressive thoughts. And you're kind of looking at an introspective reflection of yourself, your emotions, why you are feeling this way. Pondering is more of an external look, right? You're looking to the external world and trying to gather knowledge about what to do going forward, what to think going forward, how to act going forward. And so cognitive complexity was created back in the early 1950s. And it's basically, cognitive complexity is essentially multiple layered forms of judgment. It's our ability to use those multiple layered forms of judgment in certain situations and certain scenarios. And it's often formed and reinforced from years of experience, both socially in a social setting with people understanding their experiences and physically. So essentially as you age as well, as your body ages and as your brain ages as well. So once these habits form, when you're doing things for a long period of time, habits can begin to form. You get up at the same time of the day, you eat the same things, you go to work the same way. A lot of different habits can occur during the span of your life. So when these habits form, these cues automatically bring the practice response to mind and trigger relevant behaviors, even if the rewards are later removed. So essentially, what you're doing right now, it's not going to help you. Or if it did help you in the past, it no longer does. But because that behavior that users repeat in the past, because they do that, it saves energy. So they feel like it's still the best way to go about their lives, but it doesn't really help me in the long run now. And so relevancy, access, rhetorical awareness, and the ability to compose instant messages on social media were important uses of social medium within the classroom. But ultimately, it's up to the instructor's own familiarity and discretion on whether or not it can be effectively implemented. So these are all things you have to take into account when you're first deciding whether or not you want to pursue any form of self-disclosure. And so to begin, the first hypothesis of our pondering session with cognitive complexity, instructors with more familiarity and similar time devoted to social media will be able to critically evaluate potential repercussions from the disclosure of oneself over social media platforms better than those who have yet to fully implement or immerse their instruction in social media or technology. So that's our first hypothesis. And this practical method, it's also going to be used as a bucket approach, right? And so what a bucket approach means is that we're going to start with one topic, right? Pondering, that's our first element. And in order for it to work, you're going to need kind of stacking, right? Other elements are going to stack on top of one another for it to accurately perform. So that next element is going to be observation. So like I mentioned before, the bucket approach requires that pondering must be achieved. You must put critical thought into these concepts before observation can begin, before you can really sit down and begin to scan the room, to scan the literature, to scan the social medias, to see what is going on. What is the culture like? What is the vibe like? And so the operational element of observation here will be sustained attention. So right now, Generation Z and Generation Alpha kids, so the newest generations, these digital natives, are quickly becoming the vocal leaders in the spreading of trends and discourse. They're the ones most active on social media. They're the ones taking stands in social change and social issues on those platforms. 88% of those young adults admit to having and regularly using social media platforms. Now, that seems like a lot, and it is. And a lot of people might say, well, there's negative ramifications with that, isn't there? And yes, there are. But those ramifications come with how social media is used rather than just having it. Just having Twitter on your phone and looking and scrolling your For You page may not be a problem. But if you're using social media and comparing yourself or seeing others doing things, negatives might come up like isolation, anxiety, and depression. So because of this, because of the observations that instructors have made, they should be cognizant of the technology use in the classroom, only really inviting the use of it during note-taking sessions. Instructors also need to be on the lookout for students who clearly use their devices in class. They have their laptop open, but they're not really typing anything during lecture taking. And see if they're struggling academically. That might give you a clue onto what they're doing, how they might be feeling. So, but these observations need to stem from experience. They all stem from it. They stem from experience and the ability to recognize. And that all comes with how long you've been teaching, what experience you have in terms of in the classroom, and from a teaching perspective. And so our hypothesis kind of builds off that. Instructors with more pedagogical experience, so that's the number of years taught, will be better equipped to observe, recognize, and correct student technology use and the warning signs without damaging rapport more efficiently than those who have not incorporated or utilized technology into their instruction. And so because of that, again, we're going to build off observing, we're going to build off pondering into the final thing. We've achieved pondering. We've now achieved observation. So now we've observed, now we can formulate plans going forward. And so these plans will be normalizing. So we're going to be normalizing bits and pieces of disclosure. We can begin to subtly reveal that, subtly reveal our social media preferences, the stuff that we do in our private lives, those things. And so while normalization is going to be the concept tied with this model, it will be operationalized by shared homophily. So homophily is a sociological principle that states that people with shared interests, cultures, and ideologies gravitate closer to one another than those who do not have these similar elements. So the phrase opposites attract, not really a thing. It's usually when things are similar, when things are familiar, when things look like you've seen them before or done them before, that's what you're going to be gravitating towards. People are kind of afraid of change. They're afraid of stepping out of their comfort zone. So that's all homophily is. It's gravitating towards things that are familiar and similar. So it's all about alignment with one's intended audience here. We're looking at companies that are trying to sell things, advertising companies that are trying to sell a product. They are trying to relate to their audience. They're trying to establish a form of congruence with their audience. And they found that researchers found on that social media narratives. So, for example, think of polarizing discussions like on politics, religion, social issues, violence, war, those things that dealt in controversy or bipartisan issues often led to clustering of users into homogeneous echo chambers. And they didn't show evidence of the incorporation of different opinions. So echo chambers are essentially because of the algorithm, especially now. Think of the algorithms on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. You look through videos, you look through posts, you comment on posts, you interact with them longer. The algorithm is more likely to program more things like that into your feed, right? And so when we have that, the same opinion or the same content is going to be constantly thrown down into your feed. You're not going to get a chance to see other things. So these echo chambers, you're hearing the same people, you're seeing the same opinions. Those are all happening in these echo chambers, right? It's just echoing the same opinions off a wall and off other people. And so because we've now normalized the inclusion of social media and inclusion and self-disclosure through social media in this point in small increments, we can now form our final hypothesis. So instructors who have pondered and observed students' social media use, both inside and outside the classroom, will be better suited to normalize lessons plans and discussion activities that revolve around social media that will improve rapport and create opportunities for self-disclosure more effectively than those who have not yet incorporated or utilized technology into their instruction. And so now that we've kind of dove into the literature, we can now actually create our visual method. This is a bucket approach, right? And so we have to have certain elements checked off, completed, before we can go on to our next one. And so here in this PONDS method, we start off with our H1, our ponder, right? Our cognitive complexity, what we can think about, what we choose to think about. And then once we've achieved that, we move down to observation, right? Once we observe, we see the attention on social media, the attention on certain things. We can then begin to normalize what's going on. We can begin to normalize social media in our classroom. And once we finally checked off those boxes, we can decide whether or not we want to self-disclose with relevant concepts or with irrelevant concepts. And so when we talk about relevant self-disclosure, we got to make sure those three boxes are checked. And you got to ask yourself, hey, are these students going to benefit from relevant self-disclosure? Or maybe not. Then maybe some non-relevant self-disclosure may be the best course of action. So instructors who incorporate personal experience in relation to the topic at hand establishes a sense of immediacy between the instructor and the material, which often contributes to positive learning outcomes and increased willingness to learn, a decreased apprehension to course material. They also see the instructor as more credible if the discourse is relevant to the course material. However, the disclosure through social media platforms like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, they run the risk of failing if the students aren't familiar with the platform or the content being disclosed. So some of the things that you're talking about on Twitter, on Instagram, don't pertain specifically to these students. They might not react to it as well as they could have if it was more relevant. Now, when we're talking about completely irrelevant self-disclosure, it's often taken out of context. It's against the concept being discussed within the classroom setting. Now, some subjects within the university setting are going to be much easier at doing this, and much easier at disclosing with relevant information, like communication classes. Now, other subjects like math, like physics, like those applied sciences, they might not have room for any relevant self-disclosure. Now, and then any of that disclosure might seem irrelevant. But instructors need to understand that both the situation that they find themselves in, where are they right now? What are they teaching? What are their students like? Again, these are all the three concepts, the three elements that we have to check off before we go forward, before we do this. And we got to understand the situation, and we got to have the purpose behind the disclosure in order for a pro-social reaction to the discourse of choice. So these things have to happen, and that's kind of what the practical bucket approach comes in. These things have to be checked off. One can't come without the other. You can't go from pondering to disclosure because you haven't taken the other things into account. You haven't looked at other things. And so because of that, you need those three checks before you can actually self-disclose. So what are some of the problems that we see in this model? This model is simplistic. It's a three-element step. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So there's not many other elements in there, so it's simplistic. But because of that simplicity, there's going to be some unintended phenomena that may creep in, right? There are some things that we may not account for. So these crucial steps that are needed for proper execution might be missed because they are so rigid, because they are so black and white. There may be some things that need to be done but can't because this is the overall model. The model is kind of set in stone and needs to be tested by that parameter first. Like I said, strictness of the model won't allow for fluidity to measure other criteria needed for self-disclosure. There are some going to be things that you need to see that need to be done, but can't, because that's not part of the model just yet. So the model assumes that a classroom is stereotypical, that instructors and students having the same knowledge and use of social media. Instructors use the same platforms they do, look at the same things that the students do. And the students are high users of social media. They have the problems that I mentioned before in our H2. And then finally, The model will cease to accurately perform if one step is not executed correctly or it's not performed at all. Remember, bucket approach. It has to go from 1 to 2 to 3. And also, instructors do not have an in-depth knowledge of the literature and the elements for the model to run smoothly. And so finally, what are some future directions? The model hasn't been tested. This is just a theoretical framework of some things, a possibility to incorporate, to help instructors self-disclose, to find elements that'll make it easier, or to basically understand, is it worth it? Is it worth self-disclosing? The model hasn't been reviewed. It hasn't been revised. So there haven't really been critiques to say, hey, this can be done better in order for this to be improved. And then finally, the method will serve as a hypothetical framework for how instructors self-disclose through the turbulence of social media culture. So thank you guys for listening. It's been a pleasure this semester. I look forward to seeing how this will take me into life going forward. Thank you.